The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. So welcome to our Mac Attack webinar, Why OSX Isn't as Secure as You Think. Excited to have everyone here today. It's going to be a great session, but let's just do a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. So first, this webinar is being recorded. So after we conclude here today, we'll send the recording to you via email tomorrow. Some of you with Gmail, it might get stuck in your promotions tab, so please be sure to keep an eye out there. Don't want you to miss it. And throughout the session, if you guys have any questions, you can use the chat panel on your bottom right, the bottom right-hand corner of the GoToWebinar screen. If we don't get to your question today, no worries. We will follow up with you via email in the next couple days to make sure that we answer any of your questions. And with that, let me introduce our speaker today. So today we have Dan Petrillo in product marketing here at Cybereason. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Lauren.
Absolutely. All right, so Dan, I'm going to let you take it away.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate everyone here joining us. To start, I'll just give you what the agenda will be. We'll begin focusing on enterprise attack, enterprise Mac users as a target, to give you a bit of an overview of the space. Then we'll talk about OSX as an attack surface, why it's used, where it's used, how it's used, from an attacker's perspective. And then at the end, we'll talk about how to mitigate OSX threats. I know the title of this is a little grim, but it won't end that way. So with that, I'll dive right into it. So first, I want to kind of set the stage by going into some global use trends for Mac that we've seen. So now this first slide here shows that overall Mac usage is dropping, or maybe plateauing, as you can see, which might seem like it's going to go against the point that we're trying to make. But despite the fact that the overall usage is dropping, usage in enterprises is increasing. We've seen 91% of enterprise organizations surveyed using Mac machines. And this can range from the 100% Mac shops that you see in Silicon Valley to businesses with only a small handful of Macs, maybe for their executives. 44% of organizations offer their employees a choice between Mac and PC. And according to IBM's internal survey, 73% of employees want a Mac as their next computer. So you can assume that in those 44% of organizations, at least some of them, most of them will have at least some Macs. So now that we know that there are more Macs in these environments, we can't just ignore them because they are vulnerable without protection, which we'll get into in the future slides. And it doesn't matter if the environment is comprised of mainly protected Windows machines, because a few vulnerable Macs can be enough to cripple these defenses, and it can be the weak link that an attacker leverages to achieve their goal. So first, a little bit about who these Mac users are in these enterprise environments. And we've been them into three main groups. Obviously, there's more than this, but focusing on these kind of helps set the stage for understanding what we're trying to portray here. And the first group is going to be designers, UI, UX, product people. And these usually don't have too much valuable information from an attacker's perspective. I'm not going to say the information isn't valuable in general. But they'll often be used as a way to get data from an open network, or additionally a way to move laterally to other machines in the network that might be their actual target. The second group is going to be developers and DevOps, and these are a little bit more desirable from an attacker's perspective. And These are engineers who prefer working with Macs, engineers, developers, DevOps who prefer working with Macs over PC. And they are close to two interesting assets. One is source code, and the other is critical dev environments. So the source code, stealing of source code is a common MO for stealing IP and things like that. It's a common MO for Chinese hackers and the like. It's also in terms of the fact that they have access to critical dev environments, it can be a means of executing on supply chain attacks. So this is what happened with Medoc and NotPetya. And the third group is going to be senior management. So these are really the main goal of attackers. These are C-level executives, usually hold interesting information to be used for attackers for corporate espionage, extortion, or simply information that will be sold to the highest bidder. And in organizations where IT departments require Windows to be used, it's often the corporate executives who can make exceptions to this rule and get a Mac if they want to, and they often do. And this is a critical point, and I'll get into this, why it is such in future slides. So next, now that we kind of set the stage as to the fact that there are more Mac OS X machines seen in enterprise environments and who's using them, I'd like to talk a little bit about OS X as an attack surface. But first, I want to talk about why the number of OS X attacks is still limited. I'm not here to tell you that OS X is now more popular than Windows. It's definitely not the case, and there's a few reasons for that. One is a low adoption rate globally. So if you leave the West Coast, you'll see the number of Macs used drop off, and then if you leave the US, you'll see it drop off even more. Additionally, enterprise shops are not Mac only. It's much more common that you'll see a Windows only shop than a Mac only shop. And as such, most tools and techniques are developed to create the largest impact, which means developing them for Windows machines as opposed to Mac machines. So therefore, there are less grab and go tools or open source tools that can make breaching networks or exfiltrating with data easier for kind of any hacker, not just the nation state hackers or the more advanced hackers. So as such, Windows is still the path of least resistance. The hackers are going to take the path of least resistance when they can, and Windows is still that. And finally, attack monetization is harder for OS X. There's less machines globally, so the campaigns would yield not as lucrative results. And ransomware is also less effective on Mac machines for a few reasons. One of them being Time Machine. Their backup program is incredibly effective and easy to use, which really detracts from the value of these types of attacks on Mac machines. But despite all that, threats are still increasing in Mac environments. Here at Cybereason, we've seen increased malops on Macs, and most of those are around exfiltration. And what that suggests is that the Macs are actually the end target of these attackers. And if the information that an attacker wants is on a Mac, then all the above, all the reasons not to choose a Mac don't matter. That will be their target. So why is Mac still an attractive target despite everything I just mentioned? One, the Mac is safer perception. So in general, guard is down around Macs. People feel safe, and therefore they take less precautionary measures. Additionally, not a lot of security products or safeguards are developed for Mac, again, for the reasons above. Additionally, Apple introduced robust defense mechanisms only in the past few years. So contrast that with Windows, where they've had decades of learning, learning the hard way, to be quite frank, about how to deal with vulnerabilities and deal with the fact that they are the primary attack surface that hackers are using. And it's also easy to see how each version of Mac introduced new security features, and they're often quite basic compared to Windows. There's a great blog post that you can look at called Security Under the Hood Features That Protect Your Mac, and it really details what they've done. It's a lot of great work, but you'll see that it's really not quite as robust as what you're seeing in Windows machines. Additionally, every vulnerability is a critical vulnerability. Because there are not as many, each one is going to be exposed to its fullest. Additionally, Apple is not issuing service packs at the same rate as Windows, and they're not quite as attentive as Windows because they really haven't had to be. Next, lucrative targets. As mentioned before, a lot of the Mac users are going to be more likely to be the actual target of a hacker. So even if it is harder, it is their goal, so it's the route they have to take, and therefore they will. And then the last one, credentials authentication as default. So what that means is in OS X, it's a lot more common for the user to be asked to insert their credentials. And most users will do so as a reflex because they're doing it so often. And this can be leveraged by attackers because they can have the user input their credentials somewhat mindlessly and then can use that for their purposes. So let's look at this from an attacker's perspective. First, Mac is usually a safe bet for gaining value. Even with obscure endpoint naming conventions that are designed to avoid revealing critical assets, the fact that a machine might be a Mac among other Windows, no matter what its name is a telltale that it might be a more critical target than some of the Windows machines. Second, getting in is as easy as any other PC. As far as I know, Macs still have users, I'm pretty sure, and as such, they can be a means of access, just like the user can be a means of access for a Windows machine, Linux machine, whatever it might be. Additionally, within a Mac machine, you can act like any other app. So the user will think you are another app, and again, they'll input their credentials and really make the job of the attacker a lot easier once that's done. And despite Windows having so many more tools and off-the-shelf capabilities to leverage, gaining accessibility for a Mac means the attacker needs to work harder, but it doesn't mean it won't happen. A lot of security products today emphasize exfiltration because that's what hurts most for the users, but the attackers know this, and that becomes merely a speed bump rather than a roadblock for them in achieving their goal. So let's talk about some OS X attacks we've seen in the wild. It's one thing to talk about why attackers would use this, but I also want to talk about how we've seen it happening. We've seen it come to fruition, right? So one, malicious files can evade detection from signatures, and they can also steal signatures. Another thing that we see is an issue is because there are less products for Mac and because people feel safer with Mac, they just go with traditional AV. But we've seen that traditional AV is pretty easily circumvented even in a file-based attack on these machines. Next, ransomware. We have seen ransomware on OS X. It's not quite as prevalent because there's not as many of them and Time Machine is so powerful, but we still absolutely see ransomware on these machines. Exfiltration to CNC and DGA. So DGA helps evade detection and helps the attackers connect to their CNC machines, and this is just as possible on a Mac as it is a Windows machine. So there's no reason to believe you're safe against this in a Mac because it is effectively the same for an attacker to set up these types of command and control. Next, browser-based attacks and add-ons such as Peerit have been seen in Mac environments. So Windows tools can and are be ported to Mac at an increasing rate. One of our researchers, Amit Serper, has done a lot on this topic, and you can find this all on our blogs, especially on OS X Peerit. There's a lot to get into there, a lot more than we have time for today, so I highly suggest looking at some of those blogs. And along those lines, we've seen a lot of cross-platform threats that Windows, Linux, and Mac are all vulnerable to. These are more and more popular, especially as we see these enterprises having these mixed environments where if an attacker wants to move around, they need to be OS agnostic. Furthermore, we've seen rats used on OS X, Proton, SSH reverse shell. We have a lot of information on this on our website as well. I suggest reading more publications, one specifically on Proton B and the Mac ecosystem at large that will talk about how these rats have been used on Mac environments. And finally, fileless. So fileless attacks on Mac have not been seen in the wild as much as we would expect. We would expect more of these, one, because they're actually just as easy, if not easier, to perform on Mac OS as it is Windows. I think the issue there might just be that there's not enough Mac researchers for us to know the full extent of this, but we have absolutely seen these, and that's one thing that I think we can expect to proliferate. And at the end of the day, all attack vectors that exist in Windows and Linux will migrate to Mac. They either are doing so now, or they will, or they already have. So we really need to start treating OS X in a similar way that we do Windows and Linux. So the final portion of this, as I promised, that it wouldn't be all doom and gloom, is to talk about how to mitigate these OS X threats. Because it is very much possible, and we can take a lot of what we've learned in Windows and Linux and utilize this in Mac environments. So the first thing I want to really talk about is visibility. And this is something that really could be a tune that could be carried over for any OS, but I think it's something that's underutilized, and really there's a lack of visibility in these Mac environments. So some of the things you're going to want to look at are process info, file info, and DMG collection. Obviously the DMG is a little unique, but other than that, really you want to look at these processes in the same way you would in any other environment, and really do what you can to gain visibility into these machines. Like I said, it's just as easy for someone to breach a Mac environment as it is a Windows environment. And if you have visibility into what they're doing when they're in there, the good news is that these malicious activities really stand out against a normal way someone would use a Mac machine. So if you have the visibility, that's the first step in creating defense against these types of threats. And the list of things you need visibility on kind of doesn't end. You want to know what loaded modules exist. You want to look at connections, proxy and DNS requests. You want to look at the origin of files downloaded from internet and email, not just the files themselves. The origin can tell a lot about if it's something that you need to look into. You want to look at drivers, launched agents and launched daemons, login sessions, and more. So again, if you're looking at these things, if you have tools in place to have visibility of them, then you're really going to be well suited to the next step, which is to detect, prevent, and respond to these types of threats. So first, the layer is going to be prevention, right? You want to look at reputation-based prevention, you want to have threat intel, you want to have blacklisting. This is going to really reduce the noise, really eliminate some of the low-hanging fruit that attackers are going to try to use to get into your network. You want to look at web shells and DGA and things like that to prevent what you can so that your SOC can do as much as possible to address the APTs and not the more simple threats that can be blocked. The next thing that's critical to look at is behaviors. If you look at malicious behavior as opposed to just static IOCs, then you can really catch a lot more with less tools. If you look at the act of moving laterally through an environment, it doesn't matter if they're moving around a Windows, from Windows to Windows, Mac, Linux, it doesn't matter. You really want to look at the behaviors, because these malicious behaviors, these general non-negotiable steps that hackers have to take, absolutely exist in a Mac just as much as it does a Windows machine. You want to, they're going to infiltrate, they're going to move laterally, they're going to escalate privilege it, they're going to set up command and control, and these are all behaviors that you want to have visibility into, because that's the first step in remediating. And in terms of remediation, you want to be able to isolate your machines and perform as many remediation techniques as you can, because at this point, say you have your prevention mechanisms that's cutting down the noise. You have, sorry, we have a phone going off. And you can detect these, and then the last thing you're going to want to do is really respond effectively and rapidly. And now I know that this might be easier said than done, but a lot of this is in the hands of the vendors at this point. Vendors who have all these robust and powerful tools for Windows are starting to realize, everything I've mentioned above, that they really need to expand into Mac environments. The vendors are and will continue to follow the fact that the attackers are expanding into these environments, and the tools will start to mimic those that you're used to seeing with Windows. Just as I'm drawing, coming to the conclusion that an OS is an OS and attacker will use that if they can, the remediation and the prevention tools are also becoming OS agnostic, and it's critical to ensure that they cover your Mac machines as well as your Windows and Linux machines. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to any questions that we might have.
Awesome, Dan, that was great. Yeah, so we do have a few questions that came in.
Great.
So first, someone asks, what is, in your point of view, the biggest difference between Mac and Windows attacks?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be honest, I think the key is in considering them how similar they are, right? I don't think they're quite as different as we might expect. At the end of the day, the OS provides an attack surface. Hackers may run different tools on them, but the concept of the attack life cycle is the same. As I mentioned before, infiltration, lateral movement, exfiltration, command and control, etc. We really need to think of them as not being different from a Windows environment.
Got it. Another question here is, so just kind of looking forward,
Sure.
What is, in your prediction, what is your prediction in terms of future trends for Mac attacks? What do you think we're going to be seeing down the line, like things like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the biggest trend that I am gonna right now call out is I really think we're gonna see an increase of fileless attacks on Macs.
Right.
Considering how prevalent they are and growing on Windows machines and how easy it is to run them on Macs, I really don't see any reason why that attackers wouldn't start using this vector. It's effective on Windows machines. It circumvents a lot of the tools, the defense tools that are used on these. And because the defense mechanisms are less mature on Mac than they are Windows, these fileless attacks are going to be really effective for attackers to use. So I would say the future trend of Mac attacks is the growth of the increased prevalence of fileless attacks is going to spread to Macs just as it has on Windows.
Got it. Filelish, calling it now.
I'm calling it now.
Right, great. We'll check in back maybe in a few months, year later.
Hope I'm wrong.
Yeah,
but...
right. Well, right. We hope we're wrong, but we'll see if Dan was right. And then, but a year, 6 months to a year from now. Great. So next question we have is, so what's your recommendation for actually dealing with adware? You know, should we just dismiss it? I don't think that's probably not the answer, but you know, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I understand the sentiment, but the problem with Mac adware, like Pureit, for example, the one that I mentioned before, and again, it's another plug to look at my buddy Amit's research. It's really amazing what he's done and what he's found. But a lot of this adware, it's really hard to remove, and it also has invasive capabilities. It can act as a rat in cases, which makes it a lot more insidious. It almost shouldn't even be called adware at that point. And drawing the distinction really does yourself a disservice if you try to discredit, you know, the efficacy and the impact that these can have on your business. So, you know, that might be a little vague, but if you go to his blog, he actually explains how to remove OS X Pureit, and that's going to apply to a lot of the other adware that we might see. So the answer to your question is no, don't dismiss it. Absolutely remove it if possible. And there is, although their research and you know, tools available for Mac is limited compared to that of Windows, it's out there and it is available. And if you need more information on how to remove it and can't find it on our website, there's my email address. So feel free to reach out to me and we can talk about your specific case. I mean, I feel like the question might have come from experience. So
right. No,
whoever
totally.
you are, feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, right, absolutely. And you know, another plug for Amit, of course. We love Amit here. So yeah, we'll once after this concludes, and you know, we send you guys a recording. We'll also send you. Someone had asked in the chat, but we will send you guys links to all that stuff that Dan has mentioned.
Oh, perfect.
Cool. So another question we got. So are there specific guidelines for developers running Linux on a Mac environment?
Running Linux on a Mac environment. Yeah, I mean, I don't have them written down, but I can tell them to you right now. Visibility is critical, and this is kind of the tune that I sing for all OSs, but the point remains. And the main concern in this case is, in most cases, is exfiltration of code or insertion of malicious code to source code. So if you have visibility onto everything that's happening on these machines, if you're looking for malicious behavior, again, like behavior is the key here. You want to look for the act of insertion or exfiltration, lateral movement, things like that. If you have visibility, these devs who are running Linux on their Mac environments will have their first step towards creating a safe Mac environment. Got
it. So there's been here's another question. We just probably have time for like 1 or 2 questions, so I'll start wrapping this up. So there's been a few attacks on software that's popular with Mac users in the last few years. Why are attackers going after third-party software vendors? Do you have any kind of insight on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, supply chain attacks against vendors are on the rise, and that's no exception for Mac. So basically, in a supply chain attack, the attackers will hack legitimate software, insert code to make the software malicious, and the users download it without realizing that that software is malicious. This is a incredibly powerful mechanism that they use, and is the primary reason that attackers are going after this third-party software. I think, I'm not sure how long ago it was, but Handbrake, a DVD ripping tool for Mac.
Oh yes, right.
Yeah, so that was hacked, and it dropped a variant of Proton, the remote access tool, onto these machines, and that proved to be really, really effective. Trying to think of more examples. Transmission, the torrenting app, is like the uTorrent of Macs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple years ago, that was hacked to install malware. The third-party tools are a favorite tool because you've heard the cliche, living off the land and things like that. It really allows them to be stealthy, and it also gives them privilege. They look like they're trusted, and the users really put more power into the attacker's hands if they think that they're using a tool that they know and trust. So I think those couple incidences are just some examples, but it's definitely not exhaustive. But these supply chain attacks are really effective. I won't say they're easy, they're not simple, but they're easier to execute on. And the key takeaway here for Mac users is to not consider your Mac endpoints to be exempt from these supply chain attacks as you might. They are just as vulnerable, and the attacker doesn't care what OS you're using, especially if their goal, the end target, is a Mac. Like I said, these attackers take the path of least resistance, which isn't necessarily a Mac. However, if the goal is a Mac, or if it's an all Mac environment, that's not going to stop them. It might slow them down a little bit, but it's absolutely not going to stop them.
Got it. All right. So that's just about all the time we have. Thank you, Dan. That was excellent. And great session. And so just to wrap this up, everybody, we will be, like I said, we will send you the recording tomorrow, and we'll also have a bunch of links to the blogs and the articles that Dan mentioned. A lot of that is on our research area of our website, so we'll send that along. And for those of you whose questions we did not get to, we will be reaching out in the next day or so, and we will have answers for you. And we'll also post answers on our blog as well for you to look at. So I think that about wraps it up. Dan, thanks again. That was wonderful.
Yeah,
and everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you next time.